My father's laugh echoed through the mid-priced event center, drowning out the gentle Motown track the DJ had just started. The clinking of glasses and the startled gasps from the guests were instantly overshadowed by his voice booming over the speakers. He had grabbed the microphone from the retired firefighter without asking and tapped it twice, grinning like the spotlight truly belonged to him. "Everyone listen up," he said. "I just want to say a few words about the groom." I felt the blood drain from my face. I remember the look on my mother's face across the room, frozen with her hands clasped. I remember the white string lights hanging above us, casting a soft glow on the real tablecloths she had insisted on, and the warm scent of baked ham and fresh rolls that suddenly felt suffocating. I held my breath, hoping for the best, but bracing for the worst. My father had never softened his opinions or his tone for anyone, least of all for a public audience. Then he pointed openly at my husband Daniel. "This boy is an idiot," he announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. But my daughter insisted on marrying him anyway. The room froze for half a second before breaking out in a nervous, uneven, but undeniable wave of laughter. Everyone laughed. Some people laughed because they thought it was a terrible, aggressive joke. Others laughed because they were uncomfortable and wanted to blend in. What I remember most clearly, though, was the look on my husband's face. All the color drained out of it at once. His smile collapsed, and his fingers tightened around the linen napkin he held in his lap. He swallowed hard, trying desperately to keep his composure in front of our families. This man who had loved me quietly, steadily, without ever once making me feel small. My own hands began trembling immediately, even though I was a Navy lieutenant, trained to handle chaos and stress. I had been through grueling 3 a.m. storms on deck and inspections that would break a lesser sailor. Yet nothing prepared me for the humiliation that unfolded on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I didn't plan to take the microphone. I didn't plan to speak at all. My father wasn't done. He shrugged dramatically. "But hey, kids these days don't listen to their parents. What can you do?" More laughter. He basked in it like he was a comedy star. My mother stayed frozen, eyes wide, her knuckles white where her hands were clasped. My sister, always the peacekeeper, covered her mouth, her face a mask of shock. As I looked at Daniel, trying to mask his hurt, I saw a terrifying vision of the future. Every holiday, every family gathering, every birthday tainted and overshadowed by my father's cruelty. And in that moment, something deep inside me snapped. I pushed my chair back. The scraping sound cut through the nervous chatter like a sharp blade. Every head in the Columbus, Ohio, banquet hall turned toward me as I stood up. My father's smirk faded, just slightly, enough to show he hadn't expected me to react. My legs were shaking, but I walked forward anyway, slow, steady steps honed by years in uniform. I walked toward the DJ stand, stepping between the uneasy firefighter and my father. I looked directly into my father's eyes. He stepped aside reluctantly, still wearing the air of a man who assumed he controlled the room, the volume, and the narrative. I took the microphone. My legs were still shaking, but my hand holding the mic was steady. 100 faces stared back at me, curious and afraid. I took a deep breath, and then I began to speak. "Dad," I said calmly, "you've embarrassed me my whole life. But today, you crossed a line. And I'm not staying silent anymore." My father stiffened. My mother leaned forward. I looked directly into the lens of the family photographer, right past the flashbulb, and said, "I need everyone to hear this. Because my father isn't the man you think he is." I had swallowed my words for 30 years. I wasn't going to choke them down again. The moment I said those words, when I laid down the first card of the truth I had kept buried for years, both families went completely silent. What I revealed made both families freeze. They had no idea I was finally taking the microphone for myself. But to understand why the words were burning so fiercely inside me, you had to go back. Not just to the day before, but to the small two-story house in northern Ohio where my real education began. People imagine that childhood memories fade gently, like an old photograph, but mine never did. They stayed sharp, like the edges of broken glass I kept stepping on, even after 30 years. I grew up in a quiet cul-de-sac with maple trees lining the sidewalks. To everyone outside, our family looked picture perfect. My father, the respected local contractor; my mother, Eleanor, the soft-spoken church volunteer; my sister, the golden child who rarely made waves; and me, Jocelyn, the one who always asked why. As far back as I can remember, my father ran our home with a level of unwavering authority. He didn't earn respect through service or sacrifice, the way they taught us in the Navy. He claimed it simply because he existed. "Don't question me," he used to command. "I know what's best for this family." But best, in his eyes, always meant best for him and his ego. I learned early that approval came with painful conditions. I learned to smile at the right time, to speak only when spoken to, and never to correct him, not even when he was demonstrably wrong. I wasn't allowed to win too many awards, because that made him uncomfortable. But I couldn't fall short either, because that made him angry. I was forced to live in a perfect, narrow range where I could shine, but never shine brighter than his pride could handle. My mother, Eleanor, survived in silence. She wasn't weak. She was one of the strongest women I knew, capable of handling impossible pressure with a quiet grace. But she was trapped, convinced that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping love. "It's just his way," she would whisper whenever my father barked an insult or dismissed her opinion. "Your father has a difficult temperament, that's all." But I realized even as a child that difficult temperament was how our family sugar-coated emotional cruelty. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 10 years old. I had spent the entire morning helping my mother set the table. I folded the napkins into neat little fans and placed them carefully next to each plate, beaming with pride, hoping he would notice my effort. Instead, when my father walked in, he frowned at the table. "You folded these wrong," he said. And with one callous swipe of his hand, he knocked all the napkins onto the floor. I can still feel the sting of humiliation burning my face. It wasn't the criticism that hurt. It was the casual carelessness, the absolute lack of concern for how his words and actions landed. My mother started to kneel to pick up the linens, but he stopped her. "Let her do it," he instructed. "She needs to learn." But what he was really teaching me was that kindness is optional, that love is conditional, and that respect is something only adults, specifically him, deserved. That day was the first time I wondered if I would have to earn my father's love forever. Still, I grew. I excelled in school. I was a talented softball player. I joined the debate team. And I helped my mother with chores she shouldn't have had to do alone. But the more I discovered my own strength, the more threatened my father seemed to become. When I told him at 17 that I planned to join the Navy, he didn't offer pride or support. He offered mockery. "You," he sneered. "You won't last a month. You're too emotional. You'll cry and come back home." My mother stood behind him, silent as always, nervously twisting her wedding ring around her finger. But I didn't cry. I left. And I thrived. Boot camp was hard, yes, but it was liberating. For the first time in my life, discipline came with fairness. Expectations came with guidance. Respect was taught, not demanded. The Navy didn't try to break me, they tried to build me. I finally realized that true authority could exist without cruelty. When I visited home on leave, my father acted as though I'd merely gone away to summer camp. He undermined my rank, poked fun at the Navy whenever he could, and once introduced me to his friends as my daughter, who ran off to play soldier. I swallowed the insults, kept the peace, and waited for the next deployment. I was, after all, an officer of the Navy. I knew how to hold the line. But now, standing here at my own wedding, that line had been violently crossed. And I could no longer swallow the decades of bile in my throat. I had to speak, not just for myself, but for the little girl kneeling on the floor, picking up napkins, and for the strong woman twisting her wedding ring in silence. I didn't just learn strength in the Navy. I learned what real strength looked like when I met Daniel. Whenever I came home on leave, the atmosphere was thick with my father's constant undermining. He'd chip away at my rank, joke about my uniform, and generally act as though my life abroad was merely a frivolous, temporary detour. But the worst moment came when I brought home the man who would become my husband. We met at a community center gym on the east side of Columbus one cool, breezy Saturday afternoon in late October. I was home on leave and had volunteered at a clothing and food drive after a local manufacturing plant closed. The gym looked like every American multi-purpose room you've ever seen. Scuffed basketball lines, folding metal chairs, long tables piled high with jackets and canned goods. The air smelled of cheap coffee, dust, and tomato soup. That's where I saw him. He was stacking canned goods into neat rows, lining the labels up without even seeming to think about it. It was such a small thing, but I noticed. People who care about the little details are often careful with people, too. "Need a hand?" I asked. He looked up, startled, then offered a genuinely open, honest smile that reached his eyes. "Only if you're good at basic geometry," he replied. "These cans keep trying to collapse on me." I laughed, a sound I rarely made in my father's presence. "Lieutenant in the Navy," I replied. "I've seen worse structures." We worked side by side for hours. His name was Daniel West, a civil engineer for the county. He liked old trucks, listening to baseball on the radio, and fixing things other people had already given up on. When he found out I was in the Navy, he didn't joke or ask if it was too hard for a woman. "That must take a lot of strength," he said simply. "Your family must be proud." I looked down at the box in my hands. "They're working on it," I said. He gave me a small, knowing smile. That sounds like a nice way of saying they aren't. He had seen right through my carefully crafted defense in a single sentence. I realized immediately that with Daniel, I could breathe. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to defend. We exchanged numbers before I drove back to my parents' house that evening, and I realized I was smiling at nothing in particular. It felt strange and good, like a muscle I hadn't used in years was finally stretching out. Our relationship grew in measured pieces, long emails when I was deployed overseas, quick practical notes, and quiet walks when I was home. There were no games, no dramatic fights followed by even more dramatic apologies. He showed up when he said he would. He listened. He remembered the details. How I took my coffee. The name of my old bunkmate. The way I always sat facing the door. After growing up with a man whose love felt like a test, I was always about to fail. Daniel's steadiness felt like standing on level ground for the first time. He was my anchor. I didn't tell my father about him right away, knowing exactly how the conversation would go. Eventually, my mother mentioned Daniel's name by accident over dinner. "Who's Daniel?" my father demanded, his fork pausing in mid-air. "He's a man I'm seeing," I said. "He's an engineer. We met at the community center." My father smirked instantly. "So, not military. Probably soft. You need someone strong. Not some pencil pusher. Engineers build the roads you drive on." I replied quietly, feeling my old resentment rise. "And the bridges your trucks cross." His eyes went flat. "Don't get smart with me." From that night on, my father decided he didn't like Daniel, and that was that. When Daniel came over for a Sunday cookout, my father treated him like a suspect. "How much do you make?" he drilled. "You buy a house yet? Got debt?" Daniel answered every question politely. He never raised his voice or snapped back. Later, standing by his car at the curb, I shook my head. "I'm sorry," I said. "Hey can be intense." "He's not intense," Daniel replied gently. "He's mean." There's a difference. Hearing someone say it that plainly, that simply, was like having a window opened in a stuffy room. My whole life, people had used softer words for my father. Strict, old school, blunt. Mean was the first word that felt absolutely true. Still, Daniel kept coming back. He helped my mother with groceries. He fixed a loose cabinet door in the kitchen. My father stayed cold, if anything. The steady kindness seemed to irritate him more than any fight ever could. When Daniel proposed, he did it in the little park where we'd once walked. "I know your life has taken you a lot of places," he said, holding the small box. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to be home for you." I said yes before he finished the sentence. My father's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. "You're making a mistake. You'll see. But you're grown. It's your funeral." He could have stopped there, but he chose to interfere. He called relatives and suggested they stay home. He told them Daniel's family was low class, that the wedding would be awkward. He even threatened my mother that he might not walk me down the aisle. By the time our wedding day arrived, I knew exactly what my father thought of my husband. I braced myself for a rude toast or a sarcastic line. What I didn't expect was for him to seize the microphone and call my husband an idiot in front of both families. That wasn't a joke gone too far. It was the final public swing of a hammer he'd been using on us for years. And now, standing here at the microphone, with my husband's pale face, burned into my memory. I knew it was finally time to take that hammer away. The silent courage Daniel had shown me was the only strength I needed. My father's public humiliation was the consequence. But the true explosion started 24 hours earlier. You see, when you live your whole life under someone's thumb, you begin to think that weight is just part of the sky. I thought I had neutralized my father's worst impulses by refusing to fight him in the months leading up to the wedding. But he saved his cruelest, quietest blow for the night before the ceremony. The day before the wedding, our house was full of relatives. Some were unpacking suitcases, some were arguing over sleeping arrangements, and my sister was ironing her dress on the dining table. My mother, Eleanor, was rushing around the kitchen, checking on casseroles and muttering about seating charts. I was in the living room, arranging the final baskets of flowers for the rehearsal dinner, trying to hold on to the calm I had cultivated in the Navy. Then the front door opened, and my father walked in with the heavy boots and louder, then necessary sigh he always used when he wanted to make an entrance. The room went tense even before he spoke. "Where's the groom?" he asked, scratching his chin as he scanned the room. I didn't answer right away, and he didn't wait long enough to let me. "Never mind. I need to talk to you," he said, jerking his thumb toward the hallway. We stepped aside into the narrow corridor, where family photos lined the wall. Portraits of the four of us at Disney World, Christmas mornings, and birthdays, where everyone smiled, as if the camera erased whatever had happened the day before. My father stood beneath the photo of me, in my Navy graduation uniform. He had never once complimented that picture. He crossed his arms. "You still have time to cancel this wedding." I blinked. "Dad, what? Cancel it, he repeated. "I'm telling you now, because I'm trying to save you from yourself." Anger pricked my skin, sharp and immediate. "I'm not canceling anything," he scoffed. "You're emotional. You don't think straight when you're emotional." He leaned in close, lowering his voice so the relatives nearby couldn't hear. "That boy is not good enough for you. He's weak. He's soft. He makes excuses. And if you marry him, he will drag you down." It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but something about his tone, quiet, certain, almost rehearsed, hit me in a way I didn't expect. For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. "You don't know him," I finally managed. "Oh, I know enough," he snapped. "I know he's not a real man. I know he's not someone who can protect you. I know he's going to embarrass you." Embarrass me. The irony of that sentence would haunt me the next day. I steadied myself. "Dad, I love him and he loves me." "That's enough." He exhaled sharply. "Love." He repeated the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "Love won't protect you when life gets hard. Love won't pay bills. Love won't fix stupid." My chest tightened. He's not stupid. My father leaned closer, so close I could smell the mint gum he always chewed before one of his lectures. "If you walk down that aisle tomorrow," he hissed, "don't expect me to clap. Don't expect me to smile. You want to ruin your life? Fine. Just don't ask me to pretend." Then he turned and walked away, as if dropping a bomb, and leaving the debris behind was something he had trained for his entire life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the guest bed in the room I grew up in, staring at the little blue stars on the wallpaper I had picked out in 5th grade. I kept replaying my father's words until they blurred together: weak, soft, stupid, embarrass you, ruin your life. Sometime after midnight, I slipped downstairs for water. My mother, Eleanor, was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Her shoulders slouched in a way I hadn't noticed when I was younger. "You're awake," she whispered. I couldn't sleep. She nodded without looking at me. "He talked to you, didn't he?" I sank into the chair across from her. "Mom, why does he hate him so much?" She breathed out slowly. "Your father hates anything he can't control." I stared at her. She had never spoken about him like that. Not once, not openly, not honestly. "Why didn't you stop him?" I asked, the resentment toward her leaking into my voice. She wrapped both hands around her cup, warming her fingers. "I tried for years. I tried. But your father, he listens to no one, not even himself." There was something in her voice, tired and fragile, that made my heart ache. "Mom," I said softly, "has he always been like this?" She swallowed, and for a moment, I saw the reflection of decades in her eyes. "Your father has always been a man who believes he's right, even when he's hurting the people he loves most." She reached across the table, taking my hand. "But you don't have to live that way. You don't have to build your life under his shadow." Her voice cracked. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't let him take your happiness." Her words hit me so hard I had to look away. All those years, she had survived beside him, quietly, privately, without letting her pain spill into mine. Now, on the night before my wedding, she finally allowed a little of it to show. "Mom," I whispered. "I won't." She squeezed my hand harder. "Good, because tomorrow, you will start your own family." I nodded, though inside, a storm was gathering. When the wedding began, I thought the worst was behind us. I thought my father had already said everything he needed to say. But when he stepped onto that stage, grabbed the microphone, and looked out at the faces of both families, I knew exactly what was coming. He wasn't done hurting us, and he had saved his cruelest, most public blow for the moment. I said, "I do." When I finally stood at that microphone, the years of swallowed words had become a steel coil in my chest, ready to spring. I felt the microphone heavy in my hand, grounding me as I looked out at the assembled families and friends. The room was unnaturally quiet, no nervous coughs, no clinking silverware, just a deep, complete silence that held its breath. I looked straight at my father. His expression had hardened. The playful, mocking smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a look I knew well, irritation mixing with confusion. The look of a commander who had just watched a subordinate go rogue. I began speaking softly. I didn't need to shout. The silence itself would carry my voice. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel a slight tremor in my knees. "You've embarrassed me my whole life. But today, you crossed a line, and I'm not staying silent anymore." A murmur, low and quick like a brush fire, moved through the tables. My father stiffened, his jaw tightening, as if he were preparing for an impact. My mother, Eleanor, leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide, her hands now clutching each other, instead of a napkin. I had been scared for 32 years. Scared of his temper, scared of his judgment, and terrified of becoming like him. But standing there, facing him with the truth ready on my tongue, the fear was mixed with a strange, intoxicating sense of relief. "I need everyone to hear this." I continued. Because my father isn't the man you think he is. That sentence landed like a heavy stone. People stopped moving. People stopped breathing. My father's eyes flashed a warning. Don't you dare. But it was too late. I had already dared. The gravity in the room had shifted, and I was holding the new center. This is supposed to be a happy day, I said, allowing my voice to gain a little strength, echoing across the still room. And it still can be, but only if we stop pretending that cruelty is just a joke. My husband, Daniel, was still pale, seated at the main table. But his eyes were locked on mine. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He knew that I was standing up for him, yes, but mostly, I was standing up for myself and the future we were trying to build. My husband, I said, putting a firm weight on the word. He is not an idiot. I paused, letting the contrast between the two words hang in the air, his cruelty versus my certainty. The silence held, heavy and expectant. I was finally ready to tell them everything. My father called this telling it like it is. But the truth is, he was only ever telling half a story. I was done being polite. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the faces I had known since childhood, the relatives who had quietly enabled this behavior for years. My husband is the man who volunteers at the shelter on Saturdays. I continued, ticking off facts like an unassailable record. He's the man who drove my mother to her appointments when my father didn't have time. He's the civil engineer who repaired this hall's parking lot last year and refused to bill them full price because he knew they hosted charity events. A soft, impressed murmur rolled across the room. I saw Daniel's throat bob as he swallowed, his eyes shining with something that wasn't humiliation. He was watching me fight for him, something he had never asked for, but something I desperately needed to do. In all the years I've known him, I went on, my voice steadying. He has never once stood up in a room and tried to humiliate someone he claims to love. That line landed heavily. It was a direct accusation, packaged as an observation about Daniel. I turned to face my father fully, who stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Dad, I said. You call this telling it like it is. You say you're just being honest. But what you really do is hurt people and hide behind the word truth. Watch yourself. He muttered, loud enough that the front tables heard the threat. That's what you've told me my whole life, isn't it? I said into the microphone. Watch yourself. Don't step out of line. Don't embarrass me. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the years of suppressed anger exhale. But today, you embarrassed yourself. The silence deepened again. People were taking stock of what they thought they knew about the successful, loud contractor. You all know my father as a successful contractor, I said, glancing around. The man who built half the houses in this town. The guy with the loud opinions at church. The one who always has advice. A few people chuckled weakly, then stopped, unsure if laughter was still allowed. What you don't know, I continued, leaning slightly closer to the mic, letting my voice drop to a compelling quiet, is that when I joined the Navy, he told people I had run away because I couldn't handle real life. I saw an older uncle I respected drop his gaze to the table. When Daniel and I got engaged, he called relatives and told them not to bother coming, because my groom and his family were, and I quote, not worth dressing up for. My father's eyes flashed red. "That's enough," he snapped, taking a half-step toward me. "Put the mic down." "No," I said quietly, firmly shaking my head. "You've had your say for 30 years. It's my turn." My mother finally lifted her head. Her eyes were wet, and for just a second, the years of her keeping the peace sat right there, on her face for everyone to see. "You think strength," I challenged, looking at my father, "means talking down to your wife, mocking your kids' choices, and calling it tough love?" "Mom," I said, surprising even myself, "I love you. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Her hand flew to her mouth, and I saw a few women at nearby tables quietly reach for tissues. I turned back to the crowd. The final, most damning piece of the truth, ready to be delivered. "Some of you remember when Dad almost lost the house during the recession," I said. "You heard him talk about how the bank was crooked, how the government was out to get him." There were nods. People remembered that story well. "What you didn't hear," I said slowly, letting each word land, "is that he had been gambling on sports, on cards, on anything that promised quick money. He drained savings my mother, Eleanor, had quietly put away for years." My father's shoulder twitched violently, as if he had been physically struck. When she confronted him, he told her she didn't understand how business works. I explained. "I was deployed when Mom called me late one night. She didn't ask for help. She never does, but I could hear the worry in her voice. So I sent money home. A lot of it. Money I'd saved on deployments." I paused for the final line of the reveal. "Later, Dad told people he had helped me out when I was struggling. He let folks think he was the generous one." A gasp rippled through the room. I could see the sudden realization on the faces of people who thought they had known him. He had not just gambled away his family's future. He had lied about it, and taken credit for the rescue his own daughter provided. His authority, his carefully constructed reputation, was collapsing in real time. I wasn't telling them this to humiliate him. I was telling them to define what real strength looks like. "I'm not telling you this to humiliate you, Dad," I said, looking straight at him. His face was no longer red with anger, but a stark, unsettling gray. "If all I wanted was revenge, I would have walked away and never spoken to you again. I'm saying this because you walked up here today and did what you always do. You tried to tear someone down so you could feel tall." I let that sentence sit, heavy and undeniable, in the silent room. "I won't let you do that to my husband," I added. "I won't let you do it to me. Not anymore." The quiet in the room deepened. The kind of stillness where even the children seemed to hold their breath. The entire story had been appended, and the wedding guests, our families, were left to decide who the real villain was. I turned toward Daniel fully now. He was sitting ramrod straight, his eyes still shining, but the pain had been replaced by fierce concentration. "For those of you wondering," I said, my voice softer now, almost conversational, "no, he doesn't make as much money as my father wanted. No, he's not loud. No, he doesn't treat anger like a sport." A tiny ripple of nervous, genuine laughter moved through the room and quickly died down. The tension was still too thick. But when my car broke down at midnight on a dark road, he came, and he drove 40 miles to reach me. When I got bad medical news and couldn't find the words, he sat next to me and just held my hand, I remembered the long, quiet hours we had spent on the worn couch. When I told him about what it was like growing up in this house, I went on, my voice trembling at the edges, but refusing to break. He didn't say, "Get over it," he said, "I'm sorry you went through that." I looked at my father, then back to my guests. "That's the man you called an idiot." For a second, nobody moved. The air felt heavy, saturated with unspoken truths. Then, from the far corner of the banquet hall, near the dessert table, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had known my father for decades. Then, my mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, joined in. Then, another relative, and then a few more guests. It never grew into a roaring ovation, but it spread. A gentle, steady sound of acknowledgement and respect that surrounded us. It was the sound of my truth being publicly validated. My father didn't clap. His face had gone from gray to white, and he stood absolutely still, staring down at the patterned tablecloth, as if it might give him a way out of the room. He had lost control. I lifted the microphone one last time. "Dad," I said, meeting his defeated gaze. "I'm not your little girl anymore. I'm a Navy officer. I'm a wife. I'm a grown woman." I delivered the final, non-negotiable term of our continued relationship. "If you want to be in our lives, it will be with respect. Not control, not fear. Respect." Then, I lowered the microphone and set it deliberately on the DJ's table. The small, light clink of the microphone base hitting the wood seemed loud in the sustained quiet. No one spoke. No one reached for their drink. The room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the consequence. The consequence arrived in the sudden, silent shift of power. My husband, Daniel, was the first person to move. He pushed his chair back and walked toward me, his movements slow and certain. He didn't ask if I was okay or if I regretted what I had done. He simply reached out, took my shaking hand, and squeezed it. That quiet, solid pressure said more than any toast or speech could have. We had built our boundary, and we were standing behind it, together. My father stood a few feet away, one hand resting on the back of his chair, shoulders tight. I thought he might try to take the microphone back. But he didn't. His jaw clenched, and his gaze moved restlessly from table to table, searching for someone who still looked amused. Someone who might reassure him that he hadn't just lost control of the room. And perhaps, his family. No one rushed to his side. The rest of the wedding went on, but truth doesn't go back in the box. And sometimes the cruelest thing a parent can give you is their back. When I set the microphone down, no one moved at first. Daniel was the first person I saw clearly. He pushed his chair back and walked toward me. He didn't give a speech or ask if I was sure. He simply took my hand and squeezed it. That quiet, solid pressure said more than any toast. My father stood a few feet away, one hand on the back of his chair, shoulders tight. He searched the room, looking for someone who still looked amused, someone who might reassure him he hadn't just lost control. No one rushed to his side. After a long, uncomfortable pause, the DJ cleared his throat and did the only thing he knew how to do. He picked up his spare mic and said, "All right, folks. Let's take a little break. Grab some coffee. Say hello to someone you haven't seen in a while." The room broke into pockets of low conversation, the way people whisper in hospital hallways. No one could quite talk about what had just happened. But no one could talk about anything else either. My mother stayed seated. She sat at the head table with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her back a little hunched. Her eyes stayed on me. For a heartbeat. We just looked at each other, across the flowers and plates, and in that one look, there were 3 decades of swallowed words. Daniel, and I slipped out a side door, into the small concrete area, where staff took smoke breaks. The late afternoon Ohio air felt cooler and cleaner than the air inside. I feel like I just jumped off a cliff, I said. You landed. Daniel answered softly, on both feet. Are you angry I did it today? I asked. He shook his head. I'm glad you finally said something. I've watched him cut you down in little ways for years. Today was the first time I saw you answer him in kind. But without becoming him. That was the line I had always feared crossing. The thin line between standing up for yourself and turning into the person you're standing up to. My sister stepped outside to join us. Well, she said, if anybody was sleepy in there, they're awake now. Mom looks lighter somehow, worn out, but lighter. And Dad? I asked. She blew out a slow breath. He's furious, but he's shaken. He keeps staring at his plate like it personally betrayed him. We went back in. The rest of the reception went on. But there was a different tone in the room. Some relatives hugged me, when my father wasn't watching, and whispered, "You did the right thing." Others stayed close to him, their faces pinched. When the night wound down, he slipped out a side door, got in his truck, and drove off without a word to me or Daniel. In the weeks after the wedding, if you'd driven past our little rental house, you'd have seen an ordinary young couple trying to build an ordinary life. But inside, there was a steady ache. My father's silence. He didn't call. He didn't text. I kept having imaginary conversations with him, while I folded laundry or drove to the base. In my head, I told him how his words had hurt. In my head, he listened and said, I didn't realize. I'm sorry. In real life, the phone stayed quiet. One Sunday afternoon, I sat at our wobbly kitchen table and realized I was tired of arguing with the version of him that lived only in my mind. So, I wrote him a letter. Not a text, not an email, a real letter in my own handwriting. Dad, I began. I'm writing because silence has always been our way of dealing with pain. And I don't want to pass that on. I thanked him for the roof he'd kept over our heads and the years he'd worked hard to provide. Then I told him, as calmly as I could, how his words had shaped me. I explained that it had taken serving in the Navy and standing on my own 2 feet to finally believe I deserved basic respect, even from him. I will not build my marriage on fear, I wrote. I want you in my life and in my husband's life. One day I'd like you to know your grandchildren, but that can only happen if there is respect. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to try. Daniel, read it. It's firm, he said, but it's not cruel. That's a hard balance. Are you ready if he never answers? I asked. No, I said honestly. But I'm more tired of saying nothing. I mailed the letter and I waited. A week went by, then another, then a third. No call, no letter, no text. It hurt, of course it hurt. But the difference this time was that the silence wasn't because I'd swallowed my voice. It was because I had finally used it. 3 months passed before I saw my father again. On a gray Saturday morning in late spring. I heard a heavy, hesitating knock on our front door. When I opened it, my father was standing on the porch. He looked older, not just with time, but in the way someone looks when pride has been peeled back and the rawness underneath has been exposed to air. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside and nodded. We sat in the living room, a stalemate between old wounds and new boundaries. "I got your letter," he said. I read it more than once. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I had never seen in him before. "I didn't come sooner because, well, I didn't know what to say. And I didn't want to come just to defend myself. That's what I always do." He looked up at me. And for the first time since I was a child, I didn't see anger or superiority. I saw something closer to fear. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, "how much I'd hurt you or your mother, or him." His gaze slid toward Daniel before returning to me. "I told myself I was protecting you. Truth is, I was just scared. Scared you'd outgrow me. Scared you'd stop needing me." "Dad," I whispered, my throat tightening, not with anger, but deep, aching sadness. "I never stopped wanting you in my life. I just couldn't let you control it. I know that now, and I know I can't undo what I did at the wedding." He admitted. "I said things no father should say to his daughter or her husband." He paused. "I'm sorry." His apology landed like a heavy stone. Solid. Undeniable, changing the shape of the ground. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means a lot." My father looked at him. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I thought being loud made me strong. But you're strong without raising your voice." That's something I never understood. We talked for a long time, not about everything, but enough to start the kind of repair work only families can do. Before he left, he stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I can't promise I'll never mess up again," he said. "I've been this way a long time, but I'm trying. And I'd like another chance if you'll have me." I stepped closer and put my hand on his arm. "I'm not asking for perfect," I said softly, "just respect." He nodded, his eyes wet. "I can do that." He pulled me into a hug, the first genuine hug we'd shared in years. "You deserve better than what I've given you," he whispered. "So do you," I replied. "But that starts today." Months later, things aren't perfect. My father still has moments where old habits creep in, but he catches himself now. He apologizes sooner. He listens more. Holidays feel different, lighter, quieter, kinder. Daniel and I are building the kind of home where respect isn't conditional and love isn't something you earn by passing someone's test. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: silence protects the person who causes the harm. Truth protects the person who has endured it. And healing begins when someone decides the cycle ends with them.